Welcome everyone to the OSU Small Ruminant webinar series. Tonight is our second webinar in a series of 3, and we will be focusing on nutrition of both sheep and goats this evening. We have multiple speakers joining us with nutrition specializations, and we are pleased to have all of you back with us again. If this is your first time joining us for the webinar series, welcome. We do have the recordings available of the first webinar, and we will make the recording available of this one as well. Let's go ahead and get started with our first speaker of the night, which will be Dr. Ben Wenner.
As Christine said, this evening we're going to have Dr. Ben Wenner joining us. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do so in a live format, so thankfully he was able to do a recording for us, and that'll be just fine. So Dr. Ben Wenner is a professor, assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences here at The Ohio State University. He does lecture in the areas of nutrition and also our sheep production course. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll play Dr. Wenner's video here. Myself and Dr. Tony Parker is also online here with us this evening, and he and I will be more than happy to address any questions that you all may have at the conclusion of this.
My name is Dr. Wenner, and I teach at Ohio State mostly nutrition and sheep management. And then I'm happy to contribute to the sheep team as needed when I can be useful. And today I'm here to talk to you a bit about You Nutrition, both gestation and then maybe cover just a bit into transition. I wish I could join you in person and answer some questions, but unfortunately I'm pulled a few different directions at the same time. So I apologize. We'll have to look forward to a Q&A session at a different time. Let some of my colleagues answer the questions. Today, I just want to cover what I would consider to be maybe the major concerns. When I was asked to give this talk, I kind of reached out and bounced some ideas off of people. What are the things that really seem to come up? Energy and protein intake, of course, it tops the list. We want to talk sometimes about pregnancy toxemia, milk fever, mineral requirements. I'm by no means the mineral expert, but I'll give you my opinion. Water intake usually comes up in casual conversation in colostrum quality. Well, I'll just do a little breaker there for you at the end. I'm not going to talk much about colostrum. From what I can tell still, the biggest thing that faces us within the sheep industry is making sure those animals get it, making sure those animals get it early. And we have to get it early because the barrier function really kicks in and blocks the absorption of immunoglobulins after 24 hours. And I think right now we could just focus on getting lambs to colostrum within that first 12 hours. We'd be making massive progress. As far as nutrition and impacting your quality of colostrum, it's just not there yet. And the dairy folks will figure it out for us. Trust me. When I think about nutrition and actually balancing diets, I know one of the things you're probably looking for me to do today is to give you a requirement, tell you it's got to be 16% crude protein, or tell you that you got to eat this many pounds of a certain feed. And the truth of the matter is, this is the diet that I threw together, and I can write any diet you'd like and make it work. Okay? So if I pull this diet today, tell you I'm feeding it to some pregnant ewes that are going to give birth here in about 2 weeks, there's a couple things that should stand out to you. The crude protein is under 12% on a dry matter basis. Red flag, right? It's pretty low. No, it's really not. Because what I've done is I've looked at what my crude protein in pounds intake is going to be delivered, and the volume of intake more than covers what I need. From a copper standpoint, I'm over the ppm. And truth be told, they're just fine, right? Now, do we have data that says that we need to be careful about copper, especially sustained over time? Of course we do. We have plenty of data to support that. But that's also operating under the assumption of standard absorption, and much of the copper in this diet is bound up in a lot of my feed stuff. So I know that I have some safety measures in place. And so what I really want you to know is that a lot of balancing a diet is an art. So I'm not going to give you a go-to number and tell you that that's what you need to live and die by, because that would be poor advice than trying to get you to think about what I consider to be vitamin M. So this is the picture I always use. These cows, great diet, but if it's not pushed up, how are they supposed to eat it? Are they supposed to make milk? We make the same mistakes many times with our sheep ration. So ration is what we think we've drawn up on paper, right? We've got a nice diet, but then we've got to actually get it mixed at the farm or at the mill, get it home. It's never perfect. I'm happy sometimes if it just doesn't get rained on. And then I got to deliver that, actually weigh it out. How many people are weighing their animals or body taping them, deciding how big they are? How many people weigh their feed or weigh the scoop every so often to make sure that it's about right? Are we delivering our grain and our hay separate? Right? There's a lot of different confounding influences here. And so it leads the nutrition side of things to be a little bit more of an art and take a little bit more interpretation. So what I'd like to cover today maybe are some of the fundamentals that might influence the decisions that you'll make back on your own home place. So just a basic ruminant nutrition review, we have those different compartments to the stomach, right? The rumen is that fermentation vat. We have to keep the microbes happy. They grow us the B vitamins, they grow us the protein, a good majority of the protein for sheep. We favor them by keeping the pH stable. That's a management thing. It's consistent daily feeding, consistent feeds, no dramatic changes, plenty of fiber for fermentation. The reticulum is our particle sorter. The omasum is our water filter. The abomasum does that final acidification. And then the small intestines where we hopefully get those nutrients absorbed. And we've got a lot of different nutrient categories to work with. And this is why it becomes an art, because I can balance a diet and provide energy from multiple sources. I have a lot of different micro and macro minerals to take into consideration, the interplay of fat-soluble vitamins, how much structural carbs are going to come from forage versus roughage, whether or not those animals are out on pasture, whether or not I have adequate sources of grain, let alone the influences of toxins and the pressure that we have from that standpoint this year. The end goal is to keep those microbes happy. So, we've got them swimming around here. They're busy, they're happy. My guidelines there, when we think about dairy cattle, and that's where I was trained, we need to keep that fermentable starch probably above 20-25%. And I think that's not a bad number to consider in sheep as well, if you're trying to provide enough energy for them to grow and generate that protein. You have to keep the forage fiber above 10%, in my opinion. And that's going to stabilize, because your fiber digesting bacteria will help balance the pH. And you need enough of them to be able to survive in there and balance that out. You have a lot of different fibers, different types. They degrade at different rates. And sheep make this even more complicated, because to grade fibers, we need to get them all chewed up, right? So as we're going and chewing through those fiber, and we get all these puncture points in that waxy outer layer, and we increase all this surface area for exposure to bacterial enzymes, what stands out is actually a pretty big difference between sheep and goats versus cattle. And so what we know about cattle is that they're pretty good at filling the rumen up and consuming a large amount, finding a place, ruminating efficiently, and getting that ground up. Sheep do a lot more chewing. For every single gram of fiber that they're going to eat, or every kilogram of fiber, they do a lot more chewing, but they chew it to be finer. Okay, so we need to take that knowledge and apply it to what we know about the fibers that we're providing them. So sheep are going to thrive better on our average quality hays, whereas our cattle are going to do better on our poor quality hays. So you have to be careful that you don't put sheep out and expect them to make good use of a really bad batch of hay. It might be the bolus size, it might be just their general behavior. But what we know is that sheep won't move through the same amount of fiber in a day as a cow will, scaled to their body weight. So that load on the far right there, that's grams of fiber per kilogram of body weight. And sheep, they just don't move as much through. Okay? How do we capture that when we think about feeds? Well, with the climate shifting, and I've talked about this before, there's pressure that we need to start thinking about other sources for fiber besides hays. Soy hulls are a good option. Cottonseed is a standby as well, although it's a bit pricier. So then we have to start thinking about the combination of what's available in the marketplace, what's the amount of fiber or the amount of NDF, and then how digestible is that? And when we actually try and scale that and apply it back to price, and we'll see some things start to trend out. And we have to think about, why are we feeding the fiber? So remember, I said there's a kind of a minimum you must have of forage NDF, but then you can sub in some more fiber from a different source. And when you think about the pregnant ewe and you know that she's running out of space, putting in something that she doesn't have to spend as much time chewing, putting in something that doesn't have to reside as long for her to get energy from it. Soy hull, for example, that's finer ground and processed, but still providing that fiber. It's going to move through quicker. It's pretty digestible. It might be a good replacement for those ewes that are filling up and struggling to move enough through in a day to get that energy. So what we know is that as we feed more soy hulls in replacement of hay, we have an interplay over here on the right where 1/3, 2/3 soy hulls, we get actually better total fiber digestibility in the diet. And it's not until we're fully on soy hulls that maybe we're losing a bit. Certainly, we're still doing better than that hay in the control treatment. The animals are eating more feed as well. And that does associate with a slightly more expensive feed bill. But when you get into that late gestation where they're filling up, this is an opportunity to push a little bit of fiber through in your diet. And it's something that's pretty easy to manage in your feed bin, rather than trying to find a rapidly digestible or a really digestible hay, because they might be in pretty short supply. I know there's some other people who will speak to you more on soy hulls and their application within feedlot animals, and I'm personally excited to hear more about that as well, because I think it's a great opportunity. So we turned out a paper maybe this fall thinking about the energy or protein requirements for gestation. And it's probably not my most popular opinion when I tell you that no matter how hungry the pregnant mammal says that they are in the first 2 trimesters, she really doesn't have that big of a demand for her protein or for her energy, right? So this is our metabolizable energy that's required for pregnancy. And you can see a dramatic increase in that 3rd trimester. That's what should really stand out. And it's a dramatic increase only in the 3rd trimester, not before that, not before that. That same increase is matched to your metabolizable protein. So why are we always talking about your energy instead of talking about your protein supplementation, right? I told you at the beginning, I can get away with feeding a 12% crude protein diet, but I pay pretty close attention to that energy in my diet. Why am I so honed in on the energy instead of the protein? Well, when I run the math and I pull, an average 2.25 hundredweight ewe in that final month, I start looking at, let's just look at all 5 months. So in the first month on just hay alone, she's going to be in excess for energy, just average hay. Same with the 2nd month, even the 3rd month. She might even break even if she can really pound that hay through, and it's pretty good hay and she can get a lot of it. She might even break even in the 4th month, right? This is a twin bearing, 2 12-pound twins at 2.25. What you're going to find is when she breaks into the beginning even of that last month, she's going to be at a deficit. A deficit that is increasing so dramatically that you can't meet it with 1 pound of corn supplemented. And I've calculated where that pound of corn is exchanging out the hay. You can't meet it if you supplement 3 pounds of corn. And by the time she's ready to give birth, you're going to have some trouble getting enough energy in her by over a 50% substitution of hay for corn. And corn is really our energy standard in this case. On the flip side, if you think about the amount of protein coming from not just the corn, but the hay, the diet alone is going to provide up to a 1/2 pound of crude protein on a metabolizable basis. And she's going to require less than that. So even as you're scaling up her requirement for protein, she's probably been over the whole time. So unless you've really dialed back the protein in your rations, there's a good chance it's not going to be your concern. Energy is. So to pay attention to energy, the first thing you got to do is make sure that you've estimated the body weight correctly. Most of us guess wrong. I guess wrong. Take a tape. We'll buy it at Joann's or Amazon or wherever else. $5. And it's within 5%. It's pretty good. Usually about 2% unless it's an odd-shaped sheep. Measure around the heart girth, multiply that out, get a rough estimate of body weight, and that tells you how much they should be eating. Think about 2.5% of their body weight on a daily basis. The biggest thing then is to go and body condition score them. So actually go and score the spinal process, evaluate how much flesh and or fat is covering that, and shoot for a 3. But by the time she's pregnant, it's too late to change it. This is something you need to be managing through the summer. When you go and check on them, you're moving them through, you're worming them, you're trimming hooves, you're shearing them. Those are your times to feel them. Keep a note, pick out the same ones every time. You don't need to score the whole group. Take some lows, take some highs, score them, and then check them in a few more weeks or a month. When we get into the winter, especially this year is a great example. So I got this fake background behind me with these happy snowy sheep, right? This is a great example this year where you need to think about increasing the amount of energy you give them, or just flat out the amount of feed you give them by at least 5% for the cold weather. Now, they're in fleece, they're staying pretty warm, I understand that. But you'll notice they'll really pick up and start making noise as they get hungry. And in this case, it's not just a pregnancy brain hunger. They're legitimately hungry and cold. More if they're muddy or if it's really hot, if you're doing this through the summer. And when it gets very cold, I know we're looking at some single digits here, up to 20% more. That's at least what we'll do here. This Farm Health Online has a nice body condition score chart that'll guide you right through it if you haven't done it. Like I said, it's too late to change it by the time they're pregnant. And so we have this opinion that we can pull back the energy and really dial in the size of the animal, or if we really push the energy, we can overgrow those and cause some issues. Neither one has been a big issue in my experience, but I will tell you, you're more likely to overfeed and cause big lambs than you are to underfeed and cause small lambs. Undernutrition it's not going to get lamb size down for you. It might give you some weak lambs or weak ewes, dead lambs, dead ewes. That's certainly not your goal. So if you take a large data set like they did with these, I think they're Irish blackface sheep, Welsh, they're Welsh sheep. It's a nice big data set, but all it really ends up telling you is big sheep eat more food. Well, we know that. Bigger sheep have bigger lambs. We know that too. And if sheep are going to have twins or triplets, then each one of those lambs will be smaller than total fetal weight is greater, but each lamb is smaller than that single would have been. So the biggest thing you can do for yourself is get yourself to twin. That all starts again back in the summer, managing your body condition score, going into your early breeding season, having a successful flush, and choosing animals with genetics or propensity for multiples. And that's your best shot at reducing your dystocia. Okay. So high intake could increase your lamb size a little bit. Undernutrition, certainly not going to help. Don't underfeed them, it's too late. From a metabolic standpoint, I want to touch on a couple. Pregnancy toxemia is the big one. What happens? We have those fat animals, or even some average body condition or light body condition score animals. As the fetus continues to grow, or multiples, they press up on the rumen. This is a bigger issue the more conceptus volume is being occupied. And so your twins, triplets are going to be at a greater risk here. They're pressing up on the rumen and they're reducing how much space she has left to push food in. And the ewe is requiring her liver to take fermented energy, so VFA from the bacteria, and build glucose with it. She survives on glucose. So we would say that her liver is gluconeogenic. What ends up happening is that the liver continues to try and push out glucose, but because she can't get enough VFA from her fermentation, then she starts to pull her own body fat to try and build and circulate energy from her body fat. And as a short-term strategy, this is great. It's fine. We do it in dairy cattle all the time. But as a long-term strategy, she starts to build up some ketone bodies that are going to be toxic, and she starts to have some accumulation of damage in her liver. And in dairy cows, we would see this post-parturition where they've calved in and they go off of feed and they're displaced. And we have a lot of struggle getting them full again and up and running. In this case, we're also having trouble getting the ewe full, but it's because there's no space before she lambs. It's usually going to be pre-lambing. So your biggest thing is to prevent it, keep your energy up. Keep your energy up with fermentable carbs. Don't just dump a bunch of fat in there. Once it's already on set and you see that she's really lagging and dragging, you've got to jumpstart that liver. So you're going to put in like a propylene glycol, which is a precursor for glucose to help that liver signal in the right direction, because otherwise the fat mobilization triggers to her brain and says, well, we're moving fat, so it's all good. And it actually can suppress her appetite. So she's moving fat because she's hungry, but then she's getting told by her brain not to eat. And so she's going to downward spiral in a hurry. Ringworm. So this is different from that first time you that really struggles to dilate. And what you'll see in a couple of papers, and there's not a lot out there, but that does seem to associate with low serum calcium. Personal observations from some diets I've seen here in Ohio in the last couple of years is that many diets rely on just one source of calcium. That's fine, but are you testing the bioavailability of your calcium? Do you know that it's actually available, or are you just dumping in the source that you can find? And if you're not 100% sure, you might be better off to hedge your bets and put in a couple of sources. So if one of them's not that good, at least you've got two cards at play, right? Many diets on paper that I see right now, they're only meeting a calcium requirement maybe 1-to-1 with phosphorus. And this is not just a bone growth risk issue for lambs or for ewes, but it's going to limit her free calcium availability. It's also going to lead to some hypocalcemia down the road, which is our next topic. So the biggest thing you can do for yourself here is keep track of your calcium. And at least for now, all indicators are otherwise that this is a genetic issue that needs to be called out. Hypocalcemia then is where after she goes to lactate and she tries to mobilize that calcium from her bone, she doesn't do it very well. And we see this challenge. We think it's difficult in sheep. Go try and deal with hypocalcemia and bone calcium resorption in a dairy cow, where she's really working pretty hard to push out 50, 60 pounds of milk in that first month. So we have, in this case, again, many diets that are pushing calcium to phosphorus either a little bit low, or I've seen diets up to a 4-to-1 in the last year. 4-to-1 calcium to phosphorus is going to cause the opposite problem with the same result. Bone growth issues, really high blood calcium that's going to be modulated, and many of the signaling pathways are going to be down-regulated because there's so much calcium the body doesn't have to work that hard to find it. Because it's everywhere, and when she finally needs it and she pulls it out of her blood, her body's not prepared to mobilize the next level from the bone. So vitamin D deficiency can inhibit and negatively play into this as well. Ways we usually counteract this, traditionally, we would think about boosting the calcium status with alfalfa hay. If alfalfa hay is hard to find, buy alfalfa pellets. Mix those right in with your feed 50-50. And buy a bag or two of those. And that's what I like to do to just get the ewes started in the first couple of weeks. And by that point, you don't need that alfalfa hay anymore. It's pretty expensive, best to let somebody else pay for it. You just need a little bit to tide you through for the first couple of weeks. Pellets will work. From a mineral standpoint, I don't think I'm allowed to give a nutrition talk without talking about selenium. Historically, and this is an updated map, but it's the same old thing, and there's a nice summary there at the University of Georgia. Historically, this was a health issue because the soil is deficient. Okay? And within Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, is the soil still deficient in selenium? Yeah, it probably is. How are we going to know if our sheep are deficient? Well, sometimes it might be a little too late. You're going to have those weak lambs, poor doing lambs, and they might die. You're going to have in your growing or adult animals more muscle fatigue, stiffness. They're going to be kind of hunched over. And my personal take is at this point, the Bosi injection is difficult to get a hold of at times because I think there's some illicit uses for it in other parts of the human population. But also, we add plenty of selenium into the diet, most diets. You need to look at your free choice mineral, because your free choice mineral, there's a good chance it's actually already providing selenium. And if you're putting selenium in there and maybe you're mixing some selenium in a premix within your ration, or you've got a supplement pellet, you're probably already providing plenty of selenium, and you just may not realize it. Now, if you're doing all of your diet formulation from corn and hay, you don't use a free choice mineral, then you might be running into an issue. Somehow you got to get that selenium in there. I'm doing it through a free choice mineral. What I want to talk about here is, let's look at these two minerals for a second and just ask yourself, how do these differ? Okay, the tags are a little different, sure. Might be difficult to sort out on the guaranteed analysis how these two actually differ. What if we go and pull the ingredients? Pull the ingredients for the one on the left. Something's going to stand out that doesn't appear in the one on the right's ingredients. That's going to be these amino acid complexes. Okay, so we have different types of mineral sources that are out there. Amino acid complexes would be what we would call an organic source. These oxides that are down here in the mix, those are an example of an inorganic source. And we also have some hydroxychloride minerals as well. Not all minerals are created equal, and there are taste differences in minerals, not just the salt that influences intake, but the taste as well of the minerals and the way that they interact. Oxides are not going to be as available. They're going to be cheaper, sure, so you can put more of them in, but are you? That's the question you have to ask yourself. And if you're not going to, and you're only going to put a limited amount in, make sure you put in something that's a little bit more bioavailable. So an organic complex would certainly help. Even some of your sulfates are going to be improvements on your oxides. You need to pay attention to the quality of mineral that you're getting, and that you're not just dumping it out there and counting on it to do the work for you. Certainly wind and rain exposure, it's not just loss, but it's damage to the palatability of the mineral mix, as well as the availability of that mineral mix when it gets down into the small intestine. And it may not even make it there because it may interact within the rumen before it gets there, right? There's a lot of different pieces at play, but your mineral mixes are certainly not all created equal. You need to consider how you're providing it and what your expected intake is. From a water intake standpoint, man, there's nothing like fresh water day. Clean the tank out, and I don't clean it out a lot, but I clean it out, once a week. It's pretty good. Fresh water intake is a pretty big driver. So can I numerically tell you that if they don't drink a certain amount of water, they're going to struggle with lambing? Now, every time we've tried to do those studies, it's really difficult to tease it out. What we find is that in the interim, sheep do a pretty good job of balancing out, like most ruminants, when they're full, when they're empty, how do they make up for that difference? But we're going to expect they're going to drink at least a gallon of water a day if it's available. Otherwise, they might try and scoop it from snow. And if that's not available and they're not getting it from their feed, then they're going to have to borrow some water. And when they go to borrow that water, they borrow it from the rumen and they borrow it from the fetal sac. And I don't know a lot about what happens when you borrow the water from the fetal sac, but it just doesn't sound like a good idea. Keep the water thawed out, provide them the water available whenever they would like, clean, free of any off odors as best as you can, or bird or cat contaminants, and you'll be in a much better place. When we think about transitioning from our ewes to our lambs, my one little stool I like to get on every single time I can is to talk about getting them on creep feed. So this lamb in the middle, it's my favorite one to talk about. That's about 2 hours old. It's got its head stuck in the feeder. Yeah, it was a giant. I get it. Right? And did it really eat substantial amount that day? No, but I can tell you that was a heck of a lamb by the time it was done from a feed efficiency and growth and productivity standpoint. It probably had some really great looking rumen papillae. So all these little finger-like projections on the right here, these are from calves. But this is the reticulum, that particle sorter, and this is the rumen wall. And all those little things there, those are responsible for absorbing the VFA and sending them to the liver so the liver can do the work. Over here, the milk and hay calf, look how smooth that is. So the old idea of getting them started on hay first, you got to get them started on some creep feed. They can have some hay, they can nibble on it, that's not bad for them. But the goal needs to be to get them on creep feed as soon as possible to develop that rumen function. You can have them on feed on their own and do some early weaning when situations require, if you get them started and you expose them fresh feed every day, something that's available to them. We talk a lot about requirements. I know some of you probably hoped I was going to give you exact requirement numbers for these animals. But all you really have to do is you can balance your hay and your corn and probably make most things work. I have started to really shift my focus to think about responses. So requirement is what is needed to survive, to achieve function. But sometimes we give above the requirement. We get an additional response within reason. Some examples. I'm meeting my crude protein requirement for my sheep, but I give them additional lysine and I increase my muscle accretion. I'm meeting their requirement, but I give them additional methionine and I get some improved wool fiber quality or length. Methionine can also help prevent mastitis, lower somatic cell count in dairy cattle. There's some evidence that it improves fertility by early, first trimester survival and viability of the fetal attachment. Zinc, we know, can really improve and increase foot health. Vitamins can impact immunity positively. But the one I don't think very many people are paying attention to is the epigenetic side. And I think this is one of the only pictures that's it's not mine, and I can't frankly tell you where it came from, but those are some nice Scottish black-faced sheep up there. You can thank Google for that. What they did in this study a few years ago is they took a group of sheep and they fed them either a folic acid, that's your B9 with methionine and B12 deficient diets, or they added those in the diets. And at the first year, everything looked normal. The lambs come out, can't tell a difference between the groups. But by the second year, about 2 years old, they pulled those ewes and they pulled those rams, and there was a 4% shift in the DNA expression of the ones that were fed the deficient or the above adequate diets. And there was also an effect across genders. So males and females responded to this supplementation differently, which is fascinating. What we noticed in this paper, I say we, I didn't have a chance to directly participate in it, but I'm an avid reader of the work. The males were much fatter and insulin resistant. And what it does is it signals how the way that you feed the ewes today will influence the genetics and the genetic expression of your sheep a year or 2 years from now. So some of the decisions that you make that you know are right, I would just encourage you to stick with those, even if it doesn't seem like it's quite worked out for you in the first year or you've noticed a difference. Give it a chance. Maybe boost your protein a little bit if that's what you're after. Make sure your energy is not deficient. Drive that water intake. Seek a higher quality protein supplement instead of chasing a higher crude protein. Chase a higher quality supplement or change your mineral bioavailability out and upgrade your mineral. And give those decisions time to play out. And you might find that investment was worth more than you realize. So again, it was a pleasure to have you today. I wish that we'll have a chance to do this in person in the future. And I wish you all a great rest of your day and your week. Thank you.
Our next presenter with us this evening is Dr. Tony Parker. He comes from Australia for us, and he's got a nice Australian sheep in the background there. Dr. Parker is the associate chair up here in the Department of Animal Sciences at The Ohio State University. He's also a professor with us, and he so happens to be my PhD advisor as well. So we appreciate him joining us. Does a lot of work with stress physiology in cattle, a lot of work in parasitology and grazing in sheep, and he also is dangerous in the area of goats and meat production, especially back in Australia. So tonight he'll be reviewing nutrient requirements of does, and then he'll follow up later in tonight's presentation with some nutritional facts about kids. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Parker.
So we'll start off.
Looks great, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah, here we go. All right. Well, thank you again, Brady, for the introduction. So tonight I'm just going to talk a little bit about life cycle nutrition. I've done this talk for the Ohio Dairy Goat Association, and I've just taken things out and put extra stuff in just to mix it up a bit. But the other thing that I'd like to do is just put the caveat out there in the beginning that today I'll be talking about meat goat production. Certainly anyone wants to ask me questions about dairy goats and lactation nutrition for dairy goats, that's fine. Please don't hesitate to throw those questions at me at the at the end of the talk. So when looking at meat goat production cycles, quite often you'll hear people talking about supplementary feeding strategies throughout that life cycle. And where I come from, in my experience with goat production and with sheep production, I was a jackaroo before I started on a sheep property, before I started on my career path in animal agriculture. So even with my experience with sheep, has been with very arid areas, like we're talking about less than 400 millimeters of rainfall, and predominantly growing wool, but in rangeland environments as well. And so you may find that some of the things that I say, I'm dealing with the context of trying to make a lot with very little and trying to be very efficient with how we feed these animals. And I may say things which would be very different to what Dr. Wenner had said. And he's coming from an area where the USA or even Ohio is so resource rich and have wonderful pastures and lots of resources available for the animals. So that'll be the differences you might pick up on. So I'd like to start by just saying that I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of these supplementary strategies that we can place into the meat goat production cycle. And sometimes, feeding small amounts of supplements can be a very efficient way to get animals to assist them with production, with their reproduction and in their production environments. And whether they're goats or sheep, you can still do things in very small amounts that can have a significant effect on their production. Now, this example here, this timeline that I've put up, is from Dominic Blanche from the University of Western Australia and his colleagues, and they've published a review on feeding supplements. And I really like what these guys have done. They do some really good work in sheep and in goat production over in Western Australia. And I thought I would take this little example and start to elaborate on some of the things that they've said there. But first of all, in the production cycle, if you can imagine that these animals are on very little, out on pasture, grazing, because that's a really low input system. And it makes it's a very profitable system to have the animals harvest their own food rather than you bring food to them. So animals that are grazing, how can we increase the ovulation rate in these animals? And before I do that, I will also preface by saying the NRC for small ruminants has got some very good information for sheep. For goats, they really struggle with having databases big enough to make some significant predictions and estimates from. And so you'll find that a lot of the things for goats, if you've tracked back through reviews and through papers, you'll actually find that the original paper was actually on sheep. And so they take a lot of stuff from sheep and they make the assumption that what's good for sheep is good for goats. It may not necessarily be the case, or it may be. We don't know because we don't have the database for goats. And so you may see some similarities between what Dr. Wenner has said and what I've said. In Australia, we have just recently finished a program called Lifetime Wool. The number one sheep producing genotype in Australia is the Merino, where a mature ewe would be about 50 kilograms, about 120 pounds. Yep, so she's a small sheep. And we have a saying in Australia that usually merinos cannot count past one. And that's because if they have any more than one, they just walk away. And it's quite often only have weaning percentages or lambing percentages of when you go out to get them and mark them of less than 80% would be quite normal. But there is a relationship between body weight of the ewe and the number of lambs born per 100 ewes, or lambs born. And that we often, although we can't get a tape and we can't get scales, we do it by eye and by the feel of our hands, and we condition score the ewes at joining. And we know that there's a very good relationship between increasing the condition score or fatness of the animal, and increasing lambs born per 100 ewes. Now, Lifetime Wool went on to do some fantastic work. It's probably, I think Dr. Andrew Thompson from Murdoch University, again in Western Australia, was the program lead investigator on that, but it went across most of the sheep producing states in Australia. But what they came out with was that a condition score of 3 out of 5, excuse me, gave over 50% twins. It also meant that there was less than 10% dry ewes, and you can see that the effect of increasing score means more lambs born alive. Now, why did I say that about sheep when I should be talking about goats? And that is that the same relationship exists for goats, for sheep, for cattle. It's very, very similar. So when we get to the mean, or the mean of around 3 for the population, we start to see differences in how we can nutritionally manipulate the flock or the herd based on their condition score. And so a lot of the data that comes out of Australia, you'll find that the goat herd and the sheep flock are actually lower than condition score 3. And the animals that they're doing experiments on are at lighter weight than the animals that we would see here in Ohio. And so you just need to take that into context when you start reading some of the papers and what some people say. So let's talk about flushing. And flushing is the provision of an energy substrate to a doe or to a ewe for a short period of time before mating. And it's the increased energy concentration of the total diet that causes the doe to proceed from an anestrus phase into an estrous cycle, and also to increase her ovulation rate. Now, there's some caveats on that. And so, nice picture of the ovary over here with a follicular wave going from primary to secondary to tertiary to a pre-ovulatory follicle to when the actual ovum is expelled from the ovary, and then a CL forming after that. But with flushing, it's all about the body. And so if I could make one caveat about flushing, for whether it's here in Ohio or in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, it's the energy intake greater than maintenance changes the doe's body weight and body condition. And the change in body weight and condition and composition, increasing fatness, affects follicular development and ovulation rate. And so you actually find that a goat like this one that's pictured, that's in, I would say she's less than 3. I would put her back towards 2. A 2 condition score, maybe a little bit less than that. But she would be a classic candidate who would benefit from having extra energy in her diet. And she would actually benefit by increasing her ovulation rate and coming out of any anestrus. So where does it work? Well, as I said before, if you looked at these condition score figures from the American Dairy Goat Association, one being on the left of the screen, 5 being on the far right. What we often find with goats especially is that we get greater effects on ovulation rate with flushing by feeding an extra amount of energy into the diet when the body condition score is less than 3. So if they've got, starting to see their hips, you start to see their spinal process, we tend to start to get effects, at least from the experimental evidence that we have. The goats are usually in a backward store condition. And if I said that number 3 here was a store conditioned animal that was in good condition, it would be less than that. Because what we also see, and what people don't tell you, is that with flushing effects, whether it's with sheep or with goats, it's really dependent upon their body weight and their body condition. And if the animals are in an advanced condition, in condition score 4, condition score 5, we don't see any effect of flushing on ovulation rate. The animals are obviously primed. Their systems are working appropriately. They've got enough energy. They can utilize energy from within their endogenous energy stores, as well as what they're taking in through their intake. And so we don't see any effects there. The other thing that people don't talk about is the minimum time for flushing to work. And so it's almost like a priming mechanism. And so what we see is that there's only one study that I know of that actually used maize or corn for 5 days. And most studies in the last 10 years have used about 10 days. And so there's been one study, and there is a genesis of this. And I find it very, very interesting. And that is that, historically, there's been a reduction in days on energy supplement required to achieve the flushing effect by increasing ovulation rate. Many years ago, scientists and extension officers were telling farmers they had to feed a rising plane of nutrition leading up to mating, to joining. And they sort of said it was about 8 weeks. And then someone did a study, Professor Chris Oldham from University of Western Australia, did a study, and he said he looked at 6 weeks. Why does it have to be 8? And so then he found that he got the same effect. And then he found the same effect at 4 weeks. And someone else did 10 days. And they found that it had this effect as well. So thank goodness we've got our act together, and someone's been there to continually question why that is. And so we've brought down the feeding period from 8 weeks to 10 days to get that same effect. And the other thing that's happened is that there's been a reduction in the total amount of energy required. And I find it very difficult to quantify from studies, because most studies are done with animals in pastures, and groups of ewes that have been allocated to pastures, usually in droughted areas or in a dry season when the pasture is senesced and it's poor in quality. But I've got one example there of one study fed 700 grams of wheat to a 50 kilogram ewes with body condition scores of 2.8. And they fed that 3 times a week for the whole of the mating period. Now, normally in Australia, the current recommendation would be 15 days of teasing and then another 35 days of mating. So it's about 4 weeks on drought affected pasture. And yes, they did get an effect, but that's a lot of energy to go into that system. But one take home from this is that any extra energy in the diet, it does increase ovulation rate in ewes and does when the body condition score is less than 3 out of 5. Okay. Now, there's also confusion in the literature, but I don't think it is that confusing, because there's a few studies there that really point to the answers and they corroborate each other, which is very good for science to have multiple sources of corroboration. And one of them in particular was Professor Asala Tellini from in 1984. What he and his colleagues did was they took a number of different ewes, they fed them all individually. They recorded their body weights there. So they had body weights of about 54 kilograms, or about 119 pounds, 116 to 119 pounds. And they gave them different levels of energy intake. The basal forage was alfalfa hay, and they gave one basal diet of just alfalfa hay that made up about 6 megajoules per ewe per day. One where they gave lupins, which is a known protein source as well, but a safe energy in terms of no acidosis. It doesn't really induce acidosis. And something that's often used in Western Australia because it's a sandy climate and they grow those things there. And then what they did, which was very interesting, was they gave the basal diet with a glucose or acetate infusion. And the glucose and acetate infusion was an IV that went into their jugular vein, and they infused over 24 hours each day, 2.49 megajoules of energy from glucose or acetate, glucose being the primary source of energy for the animal, and acetate being a VFA that the animal could, whose liver could take and repackage that up as other forms of energy available for the animal. But what they found from this was that there was no difference in the ovulation rate between the ones fed the basal diet with the protein source, extra lupin, or whether they gave them a little bit of extra energy from in the basal diet from a glucose and acetate infusion. And so although it looks different, 1.64 versus 1.57, statistically they weren't different from each other, but both of them were greater in ovulation rate than the sheep that were fed the basal diet. And so this was a very nice piece of work because it actually demonstrates that, you know, when you start to feed lupins and high levels of protein to a sheep or to a doe, quite often there's an energy cost in having to absorb that protein, especially if it's bypassed through the rumen and it's absorbed. There's an energy cost in having to break that protein down into urea, into ammonia, repackage it up as into urea, and then export it out through the kidneys and the bladder. So there is a cost there associated with that. And just on infusing glucose and acetate, the precursors for energy use, they got the same effect. So this led on to a study that I did with a PhD student in Australia. And what we did was we took goats. They were Boer cross Australian rangeland goats, and we put them in individual crates, metabolism crates, and we fed them maintenance, a diet of maintenance, which was made up of, I've got the diet there coming up soon, maintenance with maize and maintenance with at 1.5 with maize, so 1.5 times maize. There's a diet over on the left, and you can see that it had, we had cracked maize, we had loosened pellets, we had Rhodes grass, and it was all designed around the energy requirement of the animal. What we hypothesized was that, as Dr. Wenner had said, maize is really a gold standard for small ruminants in terms of energy substrate. And it seemed to me that when you looked at the literature, whenever people fed maize, regardless of whether it was 1.5, 2.2, they always seem to be getting the same amount of ovulations per doe or per ewe. And so we asked the question, is it maize? And so we set up an experiment where we fed 6.7 megajoules of energy which was maintenance for this, for a doe. Or we did the same, but we made majority of the energy come from maize, 220 grams of cracked maize, of corn, sorry. It's maize because it's, the rest of the world calls it maize. Sorry. And then we went 1.5 times maintenance with maize. And what we got from that over on the right-hand side here was there's very little difference in any of the other parameters, but we found that the ovulation rate per doe was exactly the same whether we fed maize at maintenance, at a maintenance level, and whether we fed it at 1.5 times maintenance. But provided maize was in there, we got an increase in ovulation rate over just feeding a forage-based diet. And that's really, I think, again, Dr. Wenner hinted on this before, is that you know, maize is a gold standard for producing glucose within the animal, or propionate within the rumen, and then glucose. Maize also has about 70% of its weight as starch. I think wheat is also very high, but it's very expensive and much more expensive than maize or corn to feed. And so, because it is the gold standard, the animals can get these precursors from it from it for ovulation. Another thing about this is that the goats were smaller in size. They were about 45 kilograms, I believe, and they were also in about a 2.4 body condition score. So again, less than 3, and we only fed a very small amount, 220 grams, which is about a cup. Yep, about a cup of cracked grain to these girls. So getting back to our diagram of from Blanche and others, it might be important to also have a think about how the fetus and the placenta, at least supplementary feeding, seems to affect that throughout the gestation of the animal. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Dr. Wenner put up a sign looking at the energy requirements of gestation for sheep at singletons, twins, and triplets. And we saw this exponential curve that I've got on the right here. This curve is actually for a beef cow, but it does demonstrate the exact same thing, that majority of the growth in the fetus occurs in the last third of gestation. And what I want to point out over here on the left is this is the equation that's given to nutritionists to have to calculate from for goats. And it should be like this. It should be an exponential curve running up in an exponential fashion. But the curve is going the other way. And I think the difference is, and I've tracked it down, and it's the reason why the curve goes the other way for goats is that it's based on data which is only fetal growth, whereas this is for the entire gravid uterus, which would be the placenta, the fetus, the perinaceous fluid that the fetus is sitting within, and that increases in weight and therefore energy requirements as the animal increases or continues through her gestation. It doesn't mean that the goat one is wrong. It just means that it may not be as accurate as some of the predictions that we have for sheep and for beef cows. It gets very close though when you start thinking even at these final points here, the final point at about 148 days for singletons, maintenance and gestation, as well as maintenance plus gestation for twins. You're looking at about 18 and a half or 18.3 megajoules of energy per day versus about 15 for twins. This is this graph again, and the other thing that I find very frustrating about this graph is this line here, which is they make the prediction that for goats, for some reason, the course majority of the growth occurs within the last trimester, the last 3 months, that you only have to count back 60 days, it's 2 months actually, from the NRC requirements. So it's a little bit frustrating, but it kind of gets you there. And it makes the assumption also that there is no increase in energy required from day 1 to about day 91, I think. And that may be right or it may not be right. But we haven't got a data set to provide us with anything better. So that's what we're going with at the moment. So just thinking about that what I said before about, with twins, with triplets at the end of gestation, those does will be they'll be needing, between 15 for twins, 18 for triplets, 18 megajoules of energy. What I have there in the middle column, dry matter intake, but then ME, metabolizable energies in megacalories. Multiply that by 4.187 and you'll get megajoules. And you'll see that, we're up there with that. These predictions again from the NRC requirements are suggesting that they're going to be right up there. Now, one of the problems that that we have with that is that, especially when a doe has multiples, the size of the conceptus increases and pushes up against the rumen, and the size of the rumen actually starts to shrink. And that has a couple of effects on the animal itself. First one is that the animal can't hold as much roughage as they would like, and they would sit there and ferment, and they would regurgitate that, they'd chew on their cud, they'd swallow it again, and that process would go on. And so what usually happens when that conceptus starts to push against the rumen becomes smaller and throughput becomes quicker. And so we often get a decrease in digestibility of fiber sources as well. And again, Dr. Wenner said with sheep, it's really good if you can start to try and find some energy substrates to put in there, because even if they bypass the microbes in the rumen, they'll be digested in the small intestine and be absorbed. But a lot of people forget that with twins and triplets, and even singles to a large extent, right at the end of gestation, the animals can't possibly eat enough to fulfill the genetic requirements for growth for triplets or for twins. They really are constrained. And Ben said something which I really liked. Dr. Wenner said something that I really liked, which is what I often would tell people as well, and that is, if you could get a flock of sheep or a herd of does, and you could just have them do twins, that would be perfect. But we can get there, we can feed them, especially on pasture, with a bit of supplementation, but triplets are a really big issue. In fact, Dr. Paul Kenyon from Massey University has conducted a number of studies looking at how to feed triplet-bearing ewes. And what he's demonstrated is that it is extremely difficult to meet the energy requirements of the conceptus, the gravid uterus with the fetuses and the placenta. It's very hard to meet that energy requirement in that last third of gestation. And so what you often see is you've got these kids which will be smaller, much smaller than their singleton herd mates. And even though the total mass of kids would be greater and far greater than the singletons, these guys are still behind the 8 ball. So can nutrition affect gestation? Well, as I said before, with most ruminant species, well, with all ruminant species, 90% of the birth weight is gained during the last 40% of gestation. So for goats, between days 90 and 150 of gestation. Undernutrition can decrease birth weights of the fetus, but you've got to have a doe that's been in poor condition when she was joined. I'm saying like 2.4, should be in poorer condition there, and then she's losing a condition score throughout her gestation. That will affect birth weight. And so when you start looking through the literature about how nutrition affects birth weights of ruminants, it's quite equivocal. Sometimes there's no effect at all, even though they can lose weight. And I could give the example of if you have someone with a herd of heifers that are in condition score 6, and they lose 1 condition score, 6 to 5, there's no effect on birth weights of those animals compared with heifers that were held at condition score 6. Yeah, and the same with sheep and with goats. I would say it'd be exactly the same, and it's all about body weight and body condition reserves. And we don't give too much credibility to the animal and to the facts that even in the wild ruminants, they really rely upon the store of endogenous body reserves and as a buffering capacity for the fetus to grow. And provided that buffering effect is there, we often can see a loss in body weight, but no decrease in fetal weight. But if you really put the make it so that the ewes already in or the doe is already in a backward stall condition, and you then go and feed her very poorly, which I couldn't imagine someone doing in Ohio, you will induce that, that decrease in birth weight. Some studies going right back, this is a classic study that was done in a metabolism chamber, Everett, in 1967. They demonstrated a 12% decrease in maternal body weight, equated with a 10% decrease in fetal birth weight. But again, what they don't say in that study was what the body condition score of the ewes were when they started. And so they say that, and they interpret the data that they have by saying that along with that decrease in fetal weight, that there was also a 30% decrease in total cotyledon weight. And there was a lack of transfer of nutrients across the placenta to the fetus, and that was the cause of it. But there are a few things missing from that study. Other studies have demonstrated 7% decrease in maternal body weight with no effect on fetal body weight. And so it's a little bit equivocal, but I'll say it always comes back to body weight and body condition score of the doe or of the ewe. Overfeeding, if you overfeed through the entire gestation, yes, you can induce, it has a greater effect on dystocia rather than having these huge fetuses. The animals will grow, the whole conceptus grows, but there's a limit on how big these things can get. But there is a problem with multiple fetuses. I'll go on to that in the next one. So the issue with multiple fetuses is usually placental insufficiency, and that is that when you get into triplets and quads, those animals, when compared with singletons themselves, they're metabolically compromised, with majority of a metabolic profile that we would take from their blood as soon as they hit the ground. We would see that a kid that had come from a litter of 3 or 4 would have lower levels of glucose, lower levels of total protein. They'd have lower levels of hormones if we measured them, T3, T4, these thyroid metabolic hormones, even have compromised insulin axis and growth hormone axis as well. And quite often they don't get the colostrum requirement that they need, and they become compromised as well. And so smaller animals from, this is the issue with multiple fetuses, becomes placental insufficiency, a lack of transfer of nutrients to all of those animals, all of the fetuses. And so the animals become compromised, mainly because the energy requirements of the fetuses are not being met. Yeah, and so we get decreased birth rates, and with decreased birth rates, you know that it's going to make them more susceptible to disease and to survival as well. So we get greater mortality. There is a lack of data on goats. These 2 photos here are from a goat herd that we had at James Cook University in Northern Australia. This is my wife, the other Dr. Parker, who's a veterinarian, after delivering quads that got stuck late one night. And it was one of the greatest things I've ever seen her do, was just get that jumble of legs out of there. So they all survived, and she made sure that they survived. They were all given extra milk, supplemented. They certainly got a lot more attention than if it was just myself looking after them as the manager. Which brings me to colostrum production. So we got through gestation. I want to talk to you a little bit about colostrum production. So keep in mind that, again, I put up this graph of gestation, and right at the end of gestation, these animals require, if they've got twins, about 18 megajoules. That's a huge amount of energy for these animals. With singles, the blue line there, about 15 megajoules for a 70 kilogram doe. So it's still a lot of energy. And guess what happens? That's about the same amount of energy that they require at the peak of their lactation. So just think about that. You've got one huge peak, another huge peak, and quite often as animal husbands, we fail to get them to that point. We fail to get them up to the required amount of energy that they need. So the three most important things about raising goats or any baby ruminant is colostrum, colostrum, colostrum. Yeah, usually feeding at about 10 to 20% body weight, aiming for an IgG dose of greater than or equal to 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 1.3 grams per pound. Trying to get that to them in 4 to 6 feeds in the first 12 hours, certainly within the first 24 hours. But trying to get their IgG contents up. And this is so important because here's some data done on dairy goats, published in the Journal of American Veterinary Medicine Association in 2007. And what it demonstrates is the effect of passive transfer on pre-weaning growth in dairy goat kids. And they took the 24-hour IgG concentration in kids, and they saw that it ranged from about 15.3 to 52.3 milligrams per mil. So what? You know, and that's a big range. That to me says, oh, that's a bit of a range there. You got some which have really got a lot, and some which don't really have that much. You know, at birth, 4 kilograms. A lot of these kids were 4 kilogram kids, plus or minus 0.98. So 9 plus or minus 2 pounds, 9 pounds plus or minus 2 pounds. Then at their 30-day birth weight ranged from 5.8. So think about that. The mean birth weight was about 4 kilos. And at 30 days later, the range is 5.8 to 15. So that means that some of those kids didn't do too well, and they didn't grow that well. But from the study, one of the outcomes was the finding that for every 1 milligram per mil increase in IgG at 24 hours, the 30-day weight increases by about 185 grams, or about 0.4 of a pound, 0.407 of a pound. Almost half a pound increase for every 1 milligram per mil you increase their blood IgG concentration. And so when people tell you that it's all about the colostrum, it is. And Dr. Wenner hinted on it with the ewes. I'm telling you the same thing with goat kids. The data really confirms this, and the quality of the colostrum, the more colostrum and the higher the quality, the better the animal does over its lifetime. Here's some data from Benchero and others in 2007. And I put this data in because people often say, well, how do I do it? How do I flush to increase colostrum production? And usually it's feeding a small amount of grain, not that much. In this case, it was half a kilo, 0.6 of a kilo, I think. They were 44 kilogram Corriedale ewes. They were in one condition score of 1.5 out of 5. So they're in poor condition. These were on rangelands as well. So rangeland production systems with very lightweight ewes in a very poor body condition score. But what they did was they kept animals with no grains, and then they fed whole barley or cracked corn, cracked maize. And they got an effect. They got an effect for birth type. So certainly it's very important especially important if you have twins, you need to flush and supplement. And so with the supplement, they also found that cracked maize yielded a total amount of colostrum production, the way that they measured it, by milking the animals out at these periods of time. Cracked maize also produced more colostrum from the ewes overall. And so when people say it doesn't work, colostrum feeding doesn't work, it really comes back to when you want to give short, small pulses of grain or concentrate to does or to ewes to either increase ovulation rate, increase colostrum rate, rate and yield. It's really all about if the ewe is not in a good condition score, and sometimes they could have slipped a little bit, you will get a response if they're lower than condition score 3. So what they also found, if you go back through the literature, is that cereal grains rich in starch are usually the best forms to use as a flushing supplement. Corn is usually the best, followed by sorghum, wheat, barley. Oats has never been found to have any effect. And that's probably because it's if you compared maize with about a 70% starch content to oats would have probably 40%, 42% starch content, so a lot smaller. And the amounts, of course, if you think about the amount of glucose that's being produced from that within the animal, it's very, very different. Feeding for 5 to 10 days before parturition, and the amounts, there doesn't seem to be any consensus on that. So I found papers which show 200 grams per doe per day gets an increase in colostrum. It'd be about a cup. I've found others that have fed upwards of 800 grams of maize or corn. And so there's no real consensus there. But what we do know is those 4 things: cereal grains rich in starch, don't feed oats, feed it for 5 to 10 days before parturition, and most of the studies are feeding about more than that, about 400 grams. And I think it's also about the quality of the diet. So if we've got a not good quality diet, things are humming along. The mammary gland has gone into colostrogenesis. It's started to produce colostrum. It's starting to move on to lactogenesis. And by the time parturition occurs, and you often find that one of the outcomes of feeding supplements for colostrum is that the viscosity decreases. You tend to get a lot more, looks like the ewe or the doe is moving into lactogenesis, so starting to produce milk. But the IgGs will still be there. They'll just be very fluid, and there'll be a lot more nutrition for the kid. So I'm going to pull it up there and ask if you have any questions for me right now.
Tony, we do have some questions for you. We have at least 3 new ones since we last checked the Q&A, and then we do have those 2 that we're waiting from last time. Let's kind of proceed through these backwards. Let's start with this question from Valerie on, do you recommend colostrum supplementation? If so, should that be within the 12-hour window after birth?
Certainly if you've got multiples, you bet, because those little guys, if you leave them with the doe, or if you leave them with the ewe, they won't get enough. There's enough data in the literature to tell us that happens. So if you've got colostrum and you can thaw some out and you can give a pulse of colostrum to that kid, then yes, go and do that.
We have a question about body condition scoring and how to initially come up with a body condition score.
Yep. So I would recommend that everybody condition score their does or their ewes. I reckon they should do it at least 4 times a year. And the first time should be before joining. So you should know what the condition score of the ewes are. Now, there's a lot of information on the internet where you can download pictures. They've even got carcasses of sheep that have been cut in half at different condition scores for you to see what you're feeling and what you're looking at. But yeah, I would start off by doing that. In fact, I think were we going to have some workshops at the Ohio Sheep Improvement Day on body condition scoring, Brady?
Yes, we were planning on that, which will be this summer, and hopefully that will be able to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're planning on doing something like that. to demonstrate how to do it and to get some consensus. The other thing is when you start condition scoring and you're following the rules and we often find that you get a very good consensus with people that are doing it all the time, and especially if you know if you've got smaller numbers of animals, it's you tend to start to know them and you start to feel them and see when they start to slip or if they get too fat.
Tony,
Christine?
to follow up with that, there's another question that says, can you determine overfeeding by body condition score alone?
Yes. Yeah. So two ways to determine overfeeding is just to measure how much you're giving them. But for sure, if you're feeding as a group and you've got one animal that's going to be the boss, it's going to be be at the top of the hierarchy of the group, and you're going to know that animal's going to push everyone out the way and going to try and eat all the grain first and then leave all the forage for everyone else to eat. Quite often it's good to separate her, or we suppose goats and sheep will have a matriarch. They'll have a maternal hierarchy. They'll have a matriarch that will push everyone out the way and will eat her fill first. They're usually the biggest. But yes, just from feeling them and condition scoring them, you could be guaranteed that they're either very efficient animals, and as they fatten, they become less efficient. You need to keep that in mind, but they're either very efficient animals or they're consuming more than what's required to meet maintenance.
We have a lot of questions coming in here for you, Tony. Let's take a few more, and then we're going to get started with our next presentation. But we can also reply to some people individually in the chat if necessary, or just hang on till the end and we will get to everyone. We have a question about immunoglobulins. Can you explain a little more in detail what those are?
Yeah, so immunoglobulins are proteins that are that have immune effects for the kid. Because ruminants are not like human babies, kids are not born with an immune system, and so they have to get that antibodies that we call immunoglobulins from their mum, and they get that through the colostrum. And so the IgG just stands for capital I, little g, just stands for immunoglobulin, capital G. That's just the type of protein that's coming in, the main immunoprotein coming in through the colostrum. And so what's really unique about ruminants as well is that they have, normally those big proteins, those immunoglobulins would not be able to be absorbed and they would be broken down and digested. But for the first 24 hours, the gut wall remains open to allow those large proteins to come in. And so everything's set up waiting for it to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it just closes over and says, no, thank you. You've missed your chance. So immunoglobulins are immune stimulating proteins that come through colostrum.
Speaking of colostrum, we do have another colostrum question, and that is about commercial supplements. Do they have any benefit?
For humans? It's interesting. There's in New Zealand and in Australia in the south, the dairy industry will actually milk cows, and then there will be companies that will come and pick up the liquid colostrum, freeze dry it, and then make it as a supplement for calves, for kids, lambs, and for humans. You can get those colostrum supplements for kids. Yes, you can feed bovine colostrum and powdered bovine colostrum to kids and to lambs, and provided you get it in within that window of the first 12 hours, it does have an effect, and you can provide some passive transfer of immunity across there by doing that.
We have a couple more questions about doe behavior and how to adjust body condition scoring, but let's go back and take this question that's been here for a little while about flushing. You mentioned 15 days with the teaser and then 30 plus days for joining. When should the 10 days of flushing occur in that time frame?
I would be putting it in with the teaser. And the reason why I would do that is that the teaser is there to synchronize the ewes or the does. So you're trying to get them all to cycle at the same time. And then while they're getting their estrus cycle in sync, you want to be providing them with a little bit more extra energy to enable that when you put the bucks in, it's that ovulation that you want to start to see, to give a bit of a boost to. It's not the ovulation before when you're trying to get all of them to synchronize.
Thank you, Tony. Let's go ahead.
Dr. Parker, we've got another question here that says, this producer has a pregnant ewe that seems to be eating on her own wool. What would be the reason? Is this some type of deficiency?
Yes, so pica or eating abnormal things, even wool chewing, is usually a reflection of a deficiency in something. From my experience, it's likely to be a deficiency of fiber, long fiber in the diet. You usually find that when they become fiber deficient, and that's important for the normal operation of the rumen. It helps the rumen to contract and to push food around, and the other thing you'll find is that as they become pregnant, that rumen size, as Dr. Wenner alluded to before, the rumen size becomes so much smaller and the throughput becomes quicker. So things aren't being digested by the rumen microbes as quickly as they could be. And that could also be another factor playing into this. But long fiber usually helps with wool chewing.
I'm on with the questions here. We've got a producer that has a couple bottle yearlings, and they're struggling to get them to eat the dry mineral. It must be free choice mineral. Is it okay to sprinkle some of that into their ration? That's certainly okay to do to entice those animals to try to attempt to consume more of that mineral. Unfortunately, with that mineral being so fine, it may drop to the bottom of that feeder, and they may eventually sort it out. If you do have a whole mixed ration, if you've got a supplemental pellet in there that has all of your protein, your minerals, your vitamins, if that's the case that's within your ration, those animals should be receiving enough in that regard. Person in the chat want to know what our subscription address is, and you can find us online just by simply Googling sheep.osu.edu, and I'll have Christine put that into the chat box here while I get up our next presenter. So Dr. Relling, if you wouldn't mind just popping on your video real quick so everybody can get acquainted with you if you're able to do so. Our next speaker for this evening is Dr. Alejandra Relling. He is also in the Department of Animal Sciences here at The Ohio State University. He's a professor in the department, also a researcher. And what Dr. Relling does is he really focuses on fetal programming. A lot of the work that he's doing at the moment is taking a look at different fiber sources. So he's actually home with a new one, and thankfully he's been able to jump on with us here live. So what I'll do is to proceed forward is I'm going to share my screen. We're going to share a couple videos that he and I.
Hello everyone, welcome to the ORDC Sheep Research Center. So today we're here to talk a little bit about some of the research projects that is going on, and I think we will be able to share with you through a short video. So this trial that we have here, we have 9 pens on the trial with 10 animals per pen. We're trying to evaluate the cost and the effect of different management on fiber intake. So just to remember, sheep are ruminants, and ruminants need forage on part of the digestive physiology. So the question is, and based on today's numbers on the hay cost, we were just looking at with the team, and in Mount Hope, the bale, it costs $200 per ton. Today also, corn at a value of $180 per ton. So it's more expensive to buy hay than to buy corn. So based on that, if we have a bale, what do? We feed it to our animals, or we sell it and we buy something else? And those are the questions that we try to ask to do research so we can give you the answer. The idea of this project was to compare 3 treatments, as I mentioned earlier. In one, you can see treatment 1, treatment 2, and treatment 3, and I just randomly named them. But in treatment 1, what we have, it's a diet that has a concentrate and a fixed amount of hay. So the diet is 1/4 of a concentrate and 3/4 of hay. And the idea is they finish everything. So we call them restricted hay. It's not restricted, but we know exactly how much the animals are eating. Hey guys, follow me. On the second treatment, we choose as a concentrate source soy corn. Okay? And again, it has the same ratio than the previous diet on amount of a concentrate that is the more clear. It's a corn-based concentrate and the soy corn. And we work in the same way. They have to finish everything. Once they finish, we increase the amount of what they eat. The third treatment, they have the same amount of concentrate in this group, but a little amount of hay. So we put as much hay as they want, and I want to show you something. Follow me. Okay, so we used to use these hay feeders that's supposed to be efficient or on the amount of hay to avoid refusal. But you will see that when you feed in these ones, the animals select and choose if you don't measure or you don't control how much hay they eat. So I'm going to show you what's the leftover. So as I was mentioning, in these ad libitum animals, we continue to push, and once a week we collect the refusals to see what is there. So they can eat as much as they want. In the other ones, it's a little bit more controlled. And if you can zoom in, I want to show you a little bit of the quality. This is what we feed, this is what we offer, and this is the leftover, the refusals. Most of the time, this is going to be finishing the bed, and this has an extra cost. And you can see comparing how much short leaves or seed are in what we offer to just stems on what is left over. The idea overall on this study is to be able to have a cost of how much extra will cost to feed ad libitum hay and let the animal to choose how much they can eat versus can we control how much hay they eat based on their requirements. Okay. The second question is, if hay price goes too much, can we use an alternative source of forage like soy corn? Remember that this research is kind of follow up something that Dr. Lurch did like 20 years ago using whole corn as a diet for winter sheep. And probably if you look at the extension sheep page on the OSU extension, you will find some of those information too. So a follow-up on the study, we start the experiment as soon as we remove the ramps of the ewes, maybe within the same week, and they've been here in December. Now we are end of January, and they will be here the entire gestation. They are pregnant ewes, and they will be here the entire gestation. And as soon as we have some grass, we don't know, Ohio, when that will happen, they will be here. Once started the lamb, we are going to move them to a lambing facilities. They will be continuing the same diet, and then they will be grouped with the lambs, and they will have grass. So this is a long-term study trying to evaluate what's the best source of fiber, and if we can go with a short fiber size like soy corn, that we will see a little bit what is that, or the diet on gestating youth. So follow me. So with that, I hope that that you enjoy your presentation. You have here, where Christine is my email? Okay, here's my email. Thank you. Have a good day. Hi, how are you? Welcome to the ORDC Sheep Research Center. Today we are going to continue on to explain a little bit what we do here and share some of the research that we are conducting. We don't have data on this one yet, but hopefully if we continue with this video abstract or video teaching or learning gallery, however you want to call it, we will share some information. So if you can see in this pen, we have again, winter time is January in Ohio, and we're finishing these folamines lambs, and the question is, which source of fiber do we use? And remember, sheep is ruminant, they need a fiber, roughage, for the physiological digestive tract. The question is sometimes the cost. It's not prohibited, but limited our earnings. So what we're trying to figure out here, what's the most economical source of fiber that will benefit the animal growth. So we have 3 treatments, and they have the 3 of them have different forage source, roughage. One of the treatments, and I don't know, I will get closer to you guys. You do the cut of these in January. Okay, so for the research they provide this weekly. So this was cut in January. The whole plan is there. Probably we'll see some shots later on. But we consider this the fiber source. So we use 20% of this in the diet, and the rest is a concentrate that has proteins and minerals and the energy. If you look at the back of these pens, you will see that there are pens that seems they are in the blue gates, that the pens are a little bit larger. And I will show you later what's there in the back, but those animals have free access to hay. So they have a dividend hay intake. They can have as much hay as they want, and in the front, and we put a concentrate. Again, the same concentrate that we use with this forage. The third treatment is what we have here, and that we use soy pulp as a fiber source. So the concentrate is the same. We keep the same ratio, concentrate fiber, but what we do is soy pulp. Soy pulp is a byproduct of the soy production. So after they produce the oil and the protein, what is they cover the seed is the soy pulp, and it might be a good alternative. Again, we don't want to say it's the best or this one works better. We just want to have general data on what's the cost, how much they gain, and with having those data, you can estimate, okay, if the hay price doubles and soy pulp is cheaper, okay, we have this alternative. It's a continuous research in fiber. We did something similar a couple of years ago at the Eastern Agricultural Research Station, and the data is published on our sheep extension webpage. We didn't find any difference on the use of restricted amount of hay or restricted amount of soy pulp as fiber source. Now we are feeding ad libitum hay to see if the animal, if it's wise enough to choose one thing or the other one and the cost of it. So with that, and I will be able to answer any questions. So please feel free to shoot an email to me or to anyone on the sheep team. Thank you.
kind of stuff that gets me excited. Sarah has ewes that are eating a lot of her wheat bedding straw. How is that affecting their nutrition? They have free access to hay. It's 12% protein. They get 2 pounds of pellets. They're about to lamb in a month. What do you think about that situation?
So sorry, for some reason I cannot start a video, but probably you can hear me okay. Something that going back to some of the comments with Dr. Parker, is like, what's the body condition score of those animals? You know, most of the times, if the animals are in a good body condition score, thank you, you shouldn't be concerned about if they are eating some of the bedding. It's gonna happen. And sometimes it's kind of not to meet the requirement, but it's kind of part of the enrichment. You know, they are bored and they want to do something. So that's why they do it. The diet may be perfect and meet all the nutrient requirements, but they just play with the bedding and we assume that they are eating, but you know, we don't know. The other thing is sometimes if they are in late gestation, and that's something that on the use that on the first video that we just saw, we at the last third of gestation, if the body condition score is good, and I will say good, it's 3.5. I don't want to go more than that on a 5 scale. We restrict the feed intake. We don't feed as much because the animal will have that, and probably it's not just the sheep, but it's all of us. If you put me extra food, I will snack all day. So we restrict the amount of intake so the animals don't get overweight, and because the extra fat will make the delivery harder, you will have more prolapses. So maybe if they eat extra hay from or bedding, shouldn't be a problem if they are not in really bad body condition score. Now, if you see that they are getting thin, I would suggest try to change the bedding. So don't feed straw, try to find some like sawdust or other type of bedding. So hopefully with that I answered the question.
We have another question that is partially related to fiber and minerals as well. Glenna here says that has very few options for loose mineral products. She's trying to find one that best complements her hay. Can you recommend a good resource or tool to help her make that selection? She does have an analysis in and she's waiting on results.
First, it's one of the few people that I heard that it's checking on the forage balance to do the mineral supplementation. Most of the, even commercial feedlot of 30,000, they don't consider the basal concentration of the forage, mineral concentration to add. So there are some, and we can send, I don't want to give brands, you know, I'm not, but there are some that are specific for sheep, and what I will suggest based on the concentration of what the forage comes, what you do is just change the amount of the mineral supplement. But there are a lot commercial that are, I don't know, the people that are more used to deal with that if you give brands, but it's just check how much it's there. Most of the ones that are the blocks, probably they work okay if you put them ad libitum in a corner. If not, there are some that it's just specific amount and the number goes from, you know, 10 to 30 grams. I don't know how much that is in ounces. So you just change how much based on the mineral concentration of the forage. A lot of people, what they assume is that the forage never had enough. And in some areas, it's copper deficiency. So that's good for copper, but not for the rest of the minerals. But yeah, I don't think it's anyone that it's really bad or better, worse or better than other ones. It's just check what you have there. And once you have there, feel free to email me. I see that my email is there. If not, if you forget, you guys just ask to the ship team and Brady will share that question with me.
Tony, I will turn the floor back over to you.
Okay, I'm just unmuting my video. All right, so just to continue on from our goat story, this was a study, again, a PhD student had undertaken with me back in Australia, and I put this up to talk about, because I wanted to talk about weaning growth rates and what the expectations were. And there is a difference between what I found very interesting. We went out and did a survey in Australia, low rainfall areas to high rainfall areas, so pastoral or rangeland areas to smaller flocks where studs were on temperate pastures or improved tropical pastures. And what was very interesting to me was that the expectation of a weaning weight was exactly the same. And they didn't wean until they hit that weight. So they were weaning on weight. And for the pastoral region, it took 4.5 months to achieve. And in the high rainfall region, I think it took just over 3 months to achieve that, to get to that weaning weight. And that magical weaning weight was about 44 pounds or 20 kilograms of body weight. And so I just wanted to put that up there. And also, just for some reflection, again, we didn't get a lot of, what was very interesting to me was that we didn't get a lot of properties that actually recorded live weights or body weights of anything. And then we only had a very small subsection where we actually had records, and we could go and have a look at the records to confirm that these things were taken. They were taking body weights, birth weights, number of litter, the size of the litter, and live weights, weaning weights, etc. Throughout there. But you know, it was what I found also interesting was that the pastoral region, because of the poorer nutrition available to their goats, were always behind in either time or in body weight compared with higher rainfall areas and temperate regions where we had richer quality of nutrition available to the goats. And so, you know, I find that when comparing them, you just need to keep in mind that the system that we create, the production system that we create, really dictates the production outcomes for the animals that we look after. I put this back up here because again, this is the gestation curve, and at the end of gestation, for a ewe having twins, about 4.42 megacalories of ME per day. And the reason why I put that up there is that the next slide here, you know, if a ewe is lactating, a boar goat ewe is lactating near the peak of her lactation, she's going to require about 5.39 megacalories. So 4.4 at the end of gestation, and at the peak of lactation, if she's got triplets, about 4.39. If she's got twins, it's not that much different, and she's actually meeting that requirement by utilizing her body reserves. She's actually losing weight to do that. So that's a huge requirement. And again, you know, I can't emphasize this enough that with goats and with sheep and with cattle, with beef cattle as well, the requirement of the animal at the end of gestation is just as high as the peak of lactation, and yet we don't feed them. In either of those scenarios, we very rarely ever get them to meet their full genetic potential for either gestation or for lactation at peak. Again, here's a mid-lactation requirement for a doe with triplets, 4.42. That's still the same as a twin-bearing doe at the end of gestation. So huge requirements still placed on these animals as they produce milk through their lactation. And the other thing about lactation is that if a kid can get, or a lamb can get all of their requirements, their nutrient requirements from milk, then they will very happily take that and they won't go out and forage. And so a lot of the times you find that the thing that really separates kids in a herd of goats, the larger ones versus the smaller ones, the ones that are larger, we often say they're singles. Yep, they're singles. Mum's doing well. She's producing a lot of milk, and all of that milk is going to that single. And it is the most nutritious source of food that you could give a kid. You can't get any better than that. In fact, the protein within that casein within the milk is almost regarded as a gold standard that we evaluate all other proteins against for ruminants. So very important protein source, very important energy source and nutrient source for those kids. So it's quite amazing with goats, with their lactating dairy goats or bull goats, the requirements that are placed on them and what they do. And if they can't meet it, they're going to use their own endogenous energy reserves to try and get there. Sometimes if the energy demand is so great that they just can't possibly get there, there'll be a point where they start to, they'll walk away from their kids. And we often see that in rangelands. I put this up here just to demonstrate to you for a 4 kilogram body weight kid would have a metabolic body weight. The only reason I did that is there's a table here by Jagush, which demonstrates how they came to these equations. I guess the most important thing is to understand that that 4 kilogram body weight kid is going to require about 1.37 megajoules for maintenance. And then if we want that kid to grow at 100 grams a day, she's going to need another 1.34 megajoules of energy. So total about 2.7 megajoules of energy. Well, what does that mean? 2.7 megajoules of energy is what they require. So pre-weaning growth requirements for kids, if a liquid goat milk contains about 7.72 megacalories or 3 megajoules per kilogram, 4 kg kid, 8.8 pound kid gaining 100 grams a day is going to require about 2.71 megajoules to meet that requirement. And so a 4 kilogram kid is going to need almost 1 kilogram of milk, about 2 pounds, that 0.9 kilogram per day of goat milk is about 2 pounds of goat milk to meet that 100 grams a day growth target. Liquid milk diets for the first 2 weeks of life is normal. And even though it is hard feed that stimulates the neonate GI tract, gastrointestinal tract to produce enzymes to help digest hard feed, it's quite okay just to be drinking milk for the first 2 weeks of life if you're a baby goat. The other good thing about milk from a goat is species-specific milk for species-specific babies. Goat milk should be fed to baby goats and humans, but certainly baby goats in this case are really going to benefit from it the most. It's on tap. They have multiple feeds throughout the day. If you've got to feed them a replacer, then the more times you can break that up into 2, 3, 4 times of feeding, the better will be their digestive tract. And I know that there's a compromise between twice a day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day, every 4 hours. But I know that there's a compromise that you have to make because you've got other life commitments that are competing for your time. But same with cattle, same with lambs. With goats, if you allow them to get all of their nutrients from milk, they will not go on to hard food. They would prefer to drink that. They might play around with some food. They see mum's eating something, they'll go over and have a look at it. But certainly milk intake will really push these little guys along. We're looking at the pre-weaning growth requirements. I put this up here because, I said that in Australia with the rangeland goats, we often looked at a 20 kilogram weaning weight. And regardless, if you look at the NRC requirements for meat goats versus dairy goats, you'll always see that the dairy goats will always have a higher energy requirement, and that the bull goats will often have a higher protein requirement, or meat goats will have a higher protein requirement. And the reason for that is quite simply that dairy goats have a higher metabolic rate. They go through more energy, they burn through a lot more energy than what a meat goat would, and that a meat goat is also producing a lot more muscle tissue than a dairy goat would be as well. And so their protein requirements are a little bit higher. But calcium and phosphorus, the skeletal system, calcium and phosphorus within muscle tissue stays predominantly the same. I put this up here because it's probably one of the very few papers that have ever been published that actually demonstrate the yield of milk of bull goat. They call them ewes, but it's a doe. It's what we would call a doe for different classes. And what we can see there, different age classes, is that as the doe ages, she starts to produce more milk, whether it be a single or a double, or twins or triplets. So how do you get a kid to eat more? And like I said before, if you allow a kid to obtain 100% of its nutrients from its mum, from milk, then it will happily let you do that. And quite often it can be, especially if you're dealing with a dairy goat and you're trying to take that milk and turn it into a product. And so you want to get these kids off milk and onto hard food as soon as possible, because that means that you've got more milk to put into product when you're milking these goats. And this is some data from Tate and others, 1985. It's old stuff, produced in Journal of Animal Science. But it demonstrates that, you know, you can start to restrict milk intake by about 9% of body weight without restricting growth of the kid. And that you can see the control over there. I've got it at 135.5 grams per day. And the restriction went right down to 0.68 of a kilogram. So that's 2.2 pounds to a kilo, just over 1 pound. And those ones that were restricted in milk intake as a percent of their body weight were earning the same weight gain per day. And I said before also that solid feed increases development of the rumen. It does that. I think Dr. Wenner also showed those pictures of grain stimulating. It's actually the VFAs that stimulate production of the epithelium of the rumen and the reticulum. And dry feed also stimulates enzyme activity within the abomasum and within the small intestine as well. Total milk diets actually reduce the development of the rumen and should be avoided if you can. And so normally just the doe decreasing in its milk production will be enough to cause the kid to go out and forage or to go out and eat. And if they start to get the energy reserves, the energy requirements met by dry food or hard food, they tend to not to nurse as much. Also, the study from Tay, which I found was very interesting, is that kids at 2 weeks have been reported to be ruminating when given solid food or given access to solid food. Remember I said that for the first 2 weeks, it's totally normal to have kids have 100% of their diet from milk. So, so someone has started to, or a kid has started to eat, and yeah, I don't know. I'd like to see more papers actually be produced that would demonstrate this, that it actually happens at this stage at 2 weeks of age. Because I think, yeah, maybe 4 weeks that it happened, but 2, yeah, it might be a bit of a stretch. But apparently the authors said that occurred. And again, with that first slide that I put in this session was it meant that those Australian producers both had the same target weaning weight of about 20 kilograms of body weight. One was achieving that at about 5 months, the other was achieving it at about 3 months, and it was all about nutrition. And so quite often, some people have asked, well, is it better to wean on body weight, or is it better to wean on age? And over on the left here, we can see that weaning shock is far greater at 4 to 6 weeks than it is at 8 to 10 weeks. There is that age factor, and the fact that the animals will be a bit heavier as well. But certainly the heavier they get, the less of the weaning shock that we get. And by weaning shock, I mean that when you take a kid away from milk and it's an abrupt cessation of that diet and you give them another diet to get onto, quite often those kids will take about 10 days just to lose weight and then try and gain weight back to where they were at the start. So it takes about 2 weeks for them to correct and get onto that diet. Just remember when you do wean, and it is an abrupt wean, that these kids, especially goat kids, are very susceptible to coccidiosis and to starvation. So I wouldn't recommend weaning on age alone. I'm a great advocate of weight for age. So make sure that they get up to a good weaning weight, where you know that they're not going to starve. They've got good body reserves as well, and they're very robust, got quite a robust system, and they can handle the challenge from coccidiosis as well. Kids need to be encouraged to eat solid food if early weaning is considered when on milk. And, I'd like to think that we're not going to have that problem, but in the Southern Hemisphere, quite a few producers will wean their kids early. And so they'll wean them at 6 weeks. And it will be an abrupt cessation of access to milk. And those kids have to then go and start to forage or to give some creep feed that they're being offered in place of the milk. If you look at some of the climate predictions for Ohio, it's going to become much wetter over the winter and the early spring, and then we're going to get very dry summers, and summers are going to extend. And I think that's going to have an effect on our forages. And so, that also will have an effect on ewe body weight, doe body weight, the buck's body weight. And so we still got to start thinking about what's going to happen in the future and how these long dry summers are going to start to impact on our animal production systems going forward. But certainly when you do wean, make sure there's enough solid feed to meet maintenance. And if you can get them to eat more than maintenance, that's a good aim to try and get. But as I said before, weaning by weight is preferred to weaning by age. It prevents undernourished kids, and it just makes them a lot more robust and healthy, ready to take on the world. General rule of thumb, weaning can take place at about 2.5 times birth weight, provided solid feed intake is increasing. Okay, so weaning growth, nutrient requirements for kids. I mentioned that a 20 kg, 44 pound weaning weight was a good thing to aim for. If you looked at the ME requirements, gaining 100 grams a day, it's about 1.5 megacalories per day, 69 grams of metabolizable protein. Most of that could be made or could be achieved just through fescue alone. If it was good quality fescue had been clipped and was nitrogen fertilized, we'd certainly be able to achieve that. Whether you could get over 200 grams a day, I don't think you'd have enough ME just in fescue alone, and you have to provide some sort of supplement to that. So what does a weaning supplement look like? Got a diet up here: fescue, soybean meal, corn, and corn DDGS. Of those, I've just selected some fescue and soybean meal. It meets the total amount of dry matter intake I can get that the kids can eat. That it meets the ME, it meets the protein, and the calcium needs to just be jumped up a bit with a bit of limestone. I'm aware of the time. Sorry I've taken up and I've gone over, but do you have any questions?
Tony, we do still have some questions. We have some more that have come in, and then we have a couple that have been here for a little while. Are you able to see the Q&A box right now? You can take whichever ones you would like in the order that you like.
So there's one from Tatiana Stanton. So a suckling kid weight gain of 100 grams would be less than 1/4 pound of gain a day. Okay, so milk intake will need to be substantially higher than 1 kilogram per kid. If we are raising Easter kids and trying to have a selection, one suckling kid given, I usually find a kid generally needs to be gaining close to 1/2 pound a day to be evaluated on selection 1. Okay. Yeah, and so if you looked at some of those other figures produced from the South African ball goat does, they were actually producing, 2 to 2.5 for singletons. Some of them up to 3.5 kilograms of milk for about 7 pounds, over 7 pounds at peak for triplets. So, 100 grams a day or 1/4 pound, yep, that's what would require to get that. If you need more than that, then those does are going to have to be lactating with greater yields, and they can do that. Of course, does that answer your question? I hope so. Yeah, creep feed can help. It can help decrease that, but still, if there's been a number of really clever studies that have been done with cattle and with ewes, and it clearly demonstrates that if the ewe or the cow is lactating and she's got a lot of milk on board, those calves won't go anywhere near forage. You can make it really yummy for them and they'll want to eat it, but there'll be nothing yummier than milk, I bet. Was I correct to gather from your presentation that proper body condition score 3 to 4 out of 5 going into breeding is more important and more successful than a 10-day period? Yes. Yeah, you'll save yourself. I wouldn't do it. If my ewes or my does were in a forward condition score, I wouldn't be flushing at joining. It would be a waste.
Tony, thank you for taking the time to answer those questions. We have now resolved all our pending Q&A. If there's any additional, please just feel free to either use the Q&A or use chat or follow up with any of the speakers utilizing email. We thank all of our speakers, panelists from the previous webinar too for being on with us tonight. And we thank all of you as attendees for joining us this evening. We've had so many questions come in about nutrition between webinar 1 and 2, and we hope that many of those have been answered for you tonight.